During his more than 2 decades leading the Transportation Trades Department at the AFL-CIO, our luncheon keynote speaker built the labor collective into a strong, results-driven organization. As TTD president, Ed Wytkind was actively engaged as the voice for organized men and women, addressing the issues that arose from events such as September 11th terrorist attacks and the signing of the US-EU Open Skies Agreement. As a member of the Department of Transportation's Advisory Committee on Automation in Transportation and at many other opportunities, Mr. Wytkind underscored the vital importance of putting in place vigorous safety policies, this is important, before implementing new technologies. His focus on changing the nature of work across America is shaping the future direction of transportation labor throughout this nation. Mr. Wytkind has also served on the Board of Trustees for the Norman Y. Mineta International Institute for Surface Transportation Policy Studies and on the Eno Transportation Foundation's Board of Advisors. Ed Wytkind has served as a trusted advisor to ALPA for 2 decades. He's a close friend and a tremendous champion of U.S. aviation labor. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Ed Wytkind to the stage.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Tim. I didn't know I did all those things. I really do appreciate the generosity of your introduction, and more importantly, the ability to join all of you. I've been at it for a pretty long time. I've been involved in just about every major transportation issue that one could possibly imagine in his or her mind for over 20 years. I have a long history with ALPA. It's a proud history, both with Tim and many of his predecessors with whom I served. And if I had to sum up the work that we did, it was about really making sure that transportation workers, pilots in particular, but really all the working people in the transportation industry, that they get treated like the professionals that they are, that they have the ability to succeed on the job, that they have high labor standards, that the safety rules are what they should be, and that the people we elect not only understand their needs, but answer to their needs as the men and women that sort of walk the halls of Congress. So I think about the opportunities that I was given, and those opportunities always fed into a fairly common thread of issues. They were always about funding transportation. They were always about modernizing the system. They were always about workforce development and training. They were about making sure that the rights of workers are strong, and those who try to weaken them and undermine them fail. For 20 years plus, I did a lot of issues from trade and technology to the most basic issues like making sure our infrastructure doesn't fall down and fall apart, which literally we see every day in this country because we're sort of the neglected era now, an era that has stopped investing in its infrastructure and in its people. And so I think about many of the fights and how they feed into today's conference and my honor and privilege of being here with all of you. And, you know, I've seen the fights over fatigue and hours of service, crew sizes, not just in air, but in rail as well. I've seen the difference between a skilled workforce and people that try to cut all the wrong corners. I was there in the fights on making sure that we have U.S.-owned and controlled airlines. As Tim mentioned, I was 8 feet tall when we started negotiating the US-EU agreement, but we got to the finish line because we were able to fight for the principles that we care about, making sure that trade is fair. And I've never really recovered and never will from my experience with the September 11th attacks on our nation. One of the things that we had to do in that fight was try to figure out how to make sure that workers in the industry were not completely made the victims of an attack that had nothing to do with them. And so we went about a very methodical process of defending our members and making sure the security policies not only made the system safer and more secure, but also protected the rights and basic needs of the workers. And so we fast forward to today. I left TTD about a year ago. While it is an opportunity I will never forget, I have now delved into this innovation space full throttle. I'm now working on automated vehicles. I'm working on robotics. I'm working on artificial intelligence. And I'm watching what I think is an absolute feeding frenzy in this space. But there's sort of indisputable truths about this industry, and all these issues I've talked about, including technology, feed into them. You get the transportation system you pay for. You get the safety and security standards you demand and enforce. You get the skilled professionals you need. When you train them, pay them fairly, teach them how to uphold the highest safety standards, and give them a chance at not just a job, but a career. That is just a fact. It's indisputable because I think that is what is the cornerstone of the industry that all of us have devoted much of our life to. But now we're in this bubble, and it's a feeding frenzy. And the problem with the feeding frenzy is that it's missing some really important points. It's starting to become like one of those typical Washington events where the debate is between innovators and the rest of us who impede progress. That's how Silicon Valley wants these innovations to be portrayed. Innovators on one side and the rest of us over here because we're actually daring to ask some questions. As a debate between those who want to propel progress forward and the rest of us who apparently want to block innovation and stop progress. Well, look, I reject that frame. And this union was built, if you think about it, going back to the roots of ALPA when planes were literally falling out of the sky, to reject that frame. It is up to us, as the institutions involved in the debate about aviation and broader transportation policy issues, to make sure that we don't let those who want to frame it that way conveniently sidestep the tough questions. So what does that mean? Well, I'm seeing a bunch of large corporations, the spin-off of Google called Waymo, the big auto companies, Uber and Lyft, you name it. They're creating a lot of really robust coalitions. But let's be real clear about what these coalitions clearly are about today. And this does feed into the second part of my comments this afternoon about what you're fighting. They feed into a sort of an attitude that says we need to clear the debris. The debris to them are the tough issues. Safety, security, data. Whose data is it? Who regulates it? Privacy issues. Sorry, those are real when you're dealing in this world. Are there moral and ethical issues? One of the people that's considered sort of the father of robotics and AI, before he passed away, actually said that we are creating a moral and ethical dilemma in this country in how we're thinking about automating the workplace. And of course, there are large costs associated with infrastructure when you implement new technology. We know that. So we have to right-size and reconfigure regulations and make sure they keep things safe. And yes, there are jobs that we have to worry about. Depending on whose analysis you believe, a very large swath of the American workforce, as high as 35, 40%, according to some researchers, is at risk of either being fully automated or partially automated. So that leaves three problems, sort of a 1 and then 2A-B. The first problem is there are a lot of people who are going to lose their jobs. The second problem is the ones that don't lose their job but see their jobs change need to be trained for new skills. The 2B part is that a large percentage of those workers will not get the skills training they need. And so you'll leave too many people behind in making sure that they don't become obsolete as working people in our economy. So these issues are not debris. Safety, security, jobs, infrastructure, privacy, those are not debris. But the problem is we need to engage the employer community to get them to not treat these issues as debris to be cleared out of the way, but to actually come to the table and deal with them head on. And I mean head on. You can't ignore these questions. So what do we deal with now as we see the aviation landscape? How does all this feed into that? Well, we know what the largest corporations want to do. They want a predictive, regulatory environment where they can innovate and make a lot of money. We know that there are a lot of people out there inventing things. Some of them are really important inventions, but now they want to try to monetize them. There's nothing wrong with that. What we have to do is make sure that we make the case that technology isn't about whether it's good or bad. Technology is about how you implement it, how you regulate it. Analyze who gets hurt, who benefits. Do we share in the gains? We should stop focus on whether innovation's good or bad. Innovation's always going to be a part of our life. Without innovation, there's all sorts of things we wouldn't have in this country. Whether it's healthcare or transportation. We wouldn't have collision avoidance systems that stop transportation operators from colliding, right? We wouldn't have a lot of the things that we rely on as both consumers and as working people without innovation. But commercially applying these ideas as widely as some people want to, I worry about that. Freight trains with no operators, good idea. 150 cars with hazmat stuffed in them. We think buses can traverse city streets without a driver? Is it actually possible that you could have passenger trains going across the country without a single locomotive engineer in there? Do we want ships at sea without crew? Do we want trucks without workers in them? And how about seaports with no employees? Those are important questions, and it's okay to introduce the next generation of technology. ALPA's lived that. The next generation technology is always coming, whether it's the brand new aircraft and all the gizmos they put in those things. And every other worker in this industry deals with that reality. But do we really think that eliminating the human interaction with the machine is a good idea? Here's how I come out on these issues. I've been at it a long time. When I first started working in the transportation sector, there were still very large crews in our transportation system. So I've watched, rail crews get much smaller. I've seen what ALPA's been through and the other pilots' unions in the cockpit. So I've seen all this. But where I come out on these is our transportation system is built to perform at a very high level, but it doesn't always do that. And sort of what I've heard ALPA term non-normal conditions are pretty normal throughout the transportation system. Infrastructure deteriorates. It's just a fact of life. Equipment and technology fail. It's not perfect. Weather takes a bad turn. We have external forces that we can't control. A truck in a grade crossing when you're running a train. Bird strikes, right? So what does all that mean? That means that our safety system has to be built to perform at a very optimal level, but it must be stuffed with redundancies, with skilled employees, and with the men and women that ALPA and a lot of other unions in this country represent ready to intervene. It is that intervention. It is that, oh my God, tough, very, very tough moment we're in, but we have a skilled worker, and he or she's going to figure it out. And they do. That doesn't show up in the data. NASA, which this current legislation for single pilot operation wants to commission another study, spend more taxpayer money. Their own research shows what ALPA's saying. It is just flat out safer with 2 pilots in the cockpit. Could bore you with all the details. You've probably seen all the data. But the 2 pilots just perform better from a safety standpoint. And as a result, we shouldn't be thinking about getting rid of the human. And ALPA's own poll says what you know it says, which is the public's not really interested. By the way, I'll tell you a funny story. The public doesn't want driverless cars either. And what's really fascinating about the data is somewhere in order of 7 to 7.5 out of 10 people don't like the idea of having to share the highway with driverless cars. Do you know what segment of the population is spiking the highest against driverless cars? Millennials. I wish I was smart enough to tell you how and why that is, but it's true. I think they understand sort of at their core that it's a very sort of precarious situation that we find ourselves in. So this single pilot operation, look, I've been in lots of battles over going to single and zero crew sizes. I fought with the rail unions to stop one-person crews in the freight train industry. Why? Because one's dangerously close to zero. And we worked very hard with fact-based, really careful analysis to make the case, and so far, the case has been successful to avoid it. And that's what you're doing now at ALPA. Increasingly, the public just doesn't love these ideas. They like innovation. They want to see improvements. They want to see transportation safer, faster, more efficient. They like the idea of faster air travel, faster trains. They want a public transit system that's functional and doesn't fall apart, like we've seen, unfortunately, over the last few years here in the nation's capital. They like all that, but when you ask them questions about whether they want to get rid of the human, not so much. And for us, as safety professionals who have worked in this grind for a long time, we have to make sure that the profit motives of those who are trying to monetize these technologies do not drive the public policies. Let me say that again. The profit motives are always going to be that whether you're an auto company, an airline, an innovative company in Silicon Valley, a retail hospitality company, there are huge profit motives. I get it. But for us, those can't be the reason why you do or don't regulate in the safety area. So if safety is threatened, such as the risks we know that are connected to going to single pilot operations, we must call it the way we see it. Safe transportation requires highly skilled workers. We know that. We also know that safe transportation requires tough, well-enforced regulations. We know that safe transportation requires built-in redundancies from an overall operational standpoint, but also specifically from an employee standpoint. We know that safe transportation requires persons and machines to work together and interface, not to have the machine call the shots and not to eliminate the critical role of intervention by a worker who works in the transportation industry. Pilots, flight attendants, and air traffic controllers know a lot about that as they live in those sort of human intervention moments in the middle of flight. And they have to act quickly to figure out what to do. That goes on throughout our transportation system. We know automation can't be a debate, as I said earlier, about those who want to innovate and the rest of us who want to get in the way of progress. I think we are in this moment in time, and it feels a little bit like a rerun movie, where we have folks chasing profits and sidestepping big questions. We have advocates for regulatory flexibility, falsely accusing those in their way of blocking innovation. We have narratives being pushed that falsely claim safety outcomes from some of these innovations. Sort of a fake safety news thing going on here, which we need to understand. If you look at the surveys, the public's pretty clear. They want you to innovate. They want you to be safer. They want you to be faster, more efficient, and more effective, but they don't want to really get rid of the human. Will that last forever? I don't know, but we are in that moment in time. And so technology has always been an incredible part of the American economy. Unions everywhere in this country have interfaced with technology since you had elevator operators in our nation's hotels who literally ran the elevator. You've had unions now who have transformed into in workplaces where they have iPads with virtual reality tools that get to transform a job site. Hey, what if we change this wall to all windows? Bam, 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 poof, shows up on an iPad so that the people in charge of the project can see it. The building and construction trades unions have massive training programs. For those who don't know, they are the second largest training institution in the country, second only to the military. Over $1 billion a year spent on training and retraining. They have now embedded all the technology into their training so that the workers come out as the most skilled and certified on specific machines. So this idea that we're a bunch of Luddites in the labor movement is just a bunch of nonsense. The labor movement is a product of innovation. Those healthcare workers that interface with machines, those aren't Luddites. Those are technology experts. Those engineers that run locomotives in this country, they have had to learn, just like pilots, pretty fancy next-gen, their version of a cockpit. Lots of things they have to understand. And yet, there's still those that want to put us in the past and act like they're the ones that are trying to foster growth, innovation, and opportunity in the future. I will never let them get away with that, because one thing I know from over 20 years is that the transportation industry is only as good as its workforce. And when its workforce is threatened, when its workforce is diminished, when the workers in the industry lose their rights, when they don't have a union, which is unfortunately becoming way too commonplace in the American economy, not only do economic issues suffer, but safety suffers, security suffers, efficiency suffers, delivery of the service suffers. And so I really applaud ALPA. You have really been the gold standard on aviation safety throughout your entire history. You were born out of the ashes of unsafe aviation in this country. And now here we are again. Like I said, it's a rerun movie. Now we're going to try to fight on issues like single pilot and maybe pilotless operations in the future. I think that's a lousy idea, and I think there's a very, very compelling case why it's a lousy idea without being cast into the corner as someone who doesn't believe in innovation. I believe it, I see it, I feel it, I breathe it every day, but the human intervention, the role of the employee in this industry could not be more important today, and it's actually more important today than it probably has ever been in the history of aviation. Thank you for having me, really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Ed. You know, if you could just show a little passion, maybe you'd do a little better job. So we have a few minutes for questions for Ed, and I want to make a point as you think about a question you might have. In the decades, we went from 4 pilots, 4 crew members on the flight deck, to 3 to 2. Our union has tripled in size. That's an exact example of why, and a lot of it is due to the technology we embraced as a union, which did what? It enabled a tremendous growth in our industry, opened up more employment opportunities. So there are ways to do technology without threatening the employment of an entire class and craft of labor. That's, you know, it's just plain as the nose on our face. So any questions for Ed? Okay, I got one for you then. So I sat on the executive committee of the transportation trades while you were president. And there are times, I have to be perfectly honest, and I'm asking the former president of the transportation trades, that not all the unions agreed on issues. Okay, take the XM Bank or something like that. How do you do it? What do you do with disagreements within your own trade group on what's the proper step to take next?
So I always start that conversation with a fairly simple proposition. Those that are attempting to push a vision, a policy, a regulation, or whatever the case may be, they unfortunately count on creating division in the labor movement. I had to manage a board of 32 union presidents across 5 sectors of transportation. And 9 out of 10 times or better, we agreed on policy. As Tim has referred to, occasionally you'd have that disagreement. I think the labor movement is weak when it's divided. I've always believed that. And so I would do my best to convince people on both sides that they need to come together, and occasionally I would fail, because sometimes the divisions were too significant. But if you look at the history of transportation unions for over 20 years, if you look at all the big issues, I could count on probably a couple of hands, maybe 10 or fewer times, where we had a genuine disagreement that we couldn't work out. But what I would say to you as ALPA plus other pilot unions in the room, there's nothing weaker to the other side, I mean stronger to the other side, than seeing a weakened labor movement that's divided. And I've always said, I've come into convention halls many times where I've pleaded with delegates in a convention when I knew there was a split on the convention floor, saying, please leave here unified. Disagree on policy, disagree on maybe who your leader will be one day, but don't disagree on what you're here to do, which is to defend the pilot profession or whatever profession you happen to represent as a union. That, to me, is how I drove the conversation. Hopefully, I succeeded more than I failed.
And we're all, this room, Ed, is full of safety leaders who have to interface with their fellow leaders, and we all have to live in that world of making compromises and finding a solution out of the box. It's a tough work for all of us. So any questions for Ed?
Happy to engage.
You did have a message from the text message.
Text message, I didn't see it. Look, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, so just to paraphrase a little bit, but Ed, you talked about you've visited the tech companies and you've seen them. The question is kind of a statement and posed as a question. Are those companies full of machines programming the automation machines, or are they full of people? And is there a people element in those tech companies that are driving the automation designs?
Well, on the latter part of the question, the tech companies are absolutely driving the innovation stream we are seeing today. They are spending massive, massive amounts of money. From 2015 to 2020, we will triple the amount of venture capital that goes into robotics and AI in this country. So, and it's already billions, so if you triple billions, you're into a fairly big number. The second part of that question that I will attempt to answer is that I have a problem, and I've engaged with some in Silicon Valley about this. I have a problem with the way in which they are pursuing innovation on two levels. One, they are pursuing innovation without addressing that debris that I talked about a few minutes ago. A lot of the issues that need to be addressed are being treated as debris by a lot of the Silicon Valley organizations being created as coalitions and associations. That's problem one. Problem two, inside their own companies, they are baking business models, unfortunately, that are not great for workers. So you've got the largest, if you think about the large cap companies on the Dow, they used to be big industrials. They used to be, banks and oil companies. There's still a few of those left, but the big five darlings, they're all tech. So with that kind of organic growth, they not only drive innovation because they have more money than everybody else, but they're driving labor and employment policies that I think are to the detriment of working people, especially those that are not at the very top. The people sort of in the center and the bottom end of the belly, if you will think about it that way, those people are not doing that well. And that worries me on those two levels. So it's a great question, and it is something that people, I don't think, completely understand in this country, which is how much innovation and how much the direction of the economy gets driven by all the big tech companies that frankly have most of the money right now for that kind of venture.
Ed, thanks for sharing your thoughts and spending some time with us today, and thanks for everything you're doing in this space and continue to do, especially helping us at the AFL on the Futures of Work Commission.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, very much. Appreciate it. Thanks.